Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. The title of my presentation is here, but frankly speaking, I will be not talking about the backlash. I'll be talking about literature and social change, because the main question, my main question, would be how Polish literature, especially contemporary Polish literature, describes the past, how it is constructed, how literature invents the past. Because I think that nowadays we can find many books, fiction, non-fiction, that tells the queer past, as if literature wanted to invent the past because it was, well, silent and non-existing for so many years. But I would like to start with the quotation by German Rietz from his very influential essay written in 1998, and then it was republished in his book. German Rietz is a Swiss Slavist scholar, and that's the famous quotation, which was really very, very surprising. It's in my translation, so it's not very good, but anyway, I think that you can catch the essence, right? Is there Polish homosexual literature? And he answered in the end of 90s, yes, but it hides its own presence more than any other homosexual literature from Europe or America, but this discretion allows it to enter, take part in literary canon more than in cases of any other comparable literatures. I think it's very surprising and interesting because it's very symptomatic. Rietz said that there is a lot of homosexuality in Polish literature, which was very surprising at the end of 90s. And we have to remember that he wrote mostly about the interwar period. He said that there is more homosexuality, more homosexual themes than in any other literatures, which is even more surprising, and that is hidden in the canon. But I think that today we have to put another question: why literature is important at all for emancipatory purposes? And of course, there are some answers. One of them is that Polish culture is literary-centric. Maria Janion said such a thing. Maybe it's not so true today, but it was true for many, many years. And there's another answer which I really like, that literature is kind of national allegory. I took it from the Frederick Jameson famous essay, Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. And I think, of course, the term third world and first world is not very nice and fair today. But anyway, I think that the intuition behind that statement is really interesting. He says that all third world texts are necessarily, I want to argue, allegorical and in a very specific way. They are to be read as what I will call national allegories, even when, or perhaps I should say particularly, when the forms develop from out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, such as a novel. So we could say today that in peripheries or semi-peripheries of global capitalism, using Immanuel Wallerstein's term, canon of literature can function as national allegory, and that's why it's especially important for emancipatory purposes. And maybe because of that, German Rietz statement was so interesting and so symptomatic, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely true. Of course, I think that today literature doesn't give so much legitimization as it was before, but I think it still can be read and is treated somehow like a national allegory. So because of that, I would like to look at Polish literature together with social change, and from that point of view we could talk about more or less 3 waves of emancipation, especially when we think about literature as source of narratives that describe us to ourselves, I would say. So we have the first stage, early stage, the 80s, that's the decades, right? The 80s, the 90s, and since 2003, because 2003, that was Let Us See campaign date. And well, I would, the first one was, of course, described by Łukasz Schulz. The second one is kind of golden age of emancipation. And after 2003, homosexuality and LGBT issues entered public discourse. But let's come back to the first stage. And I think there are two interesting novels that appeared at the beginning of the 80s. It's Julian Stryjkowski, Tommaso del Cavaliere, and Marian Pankowski, Rudolf. That's the beginning of the 80s. The first one is about the brilliant artist Michelangelo, seen from the perspective of his overlooked student. And the second one is about a Polish professor who meets German homosexual who took pleasure in remaining on the margin of society, which of course shocked the professor. And I think it's interesting because it shows two figures of male homosexuality, artist and the pervert, and nothing more, nothing between. Only these two figures we can find, these two, let's say, extremes. Of course, the 80s was described by Łukasz Schulz in his great book, Transnational Homosexual in Communist Poland. There is Agata Fiedotov, and her analysis of letters that were sent from homosexuals to International Lesbian and Gay Association. But I would like to mention another cultural phenomenon, which is really very important from my point of view. That's a cultural phenomenon from the 70s and the beginning of mostly 80s. That's the series of collection of anthologies, titles Transgresja. And especially the first two are very important from emancipatory point of view. Galernicy Wrażliwości, know how to translate it, and Odmieńcy. Of course, it's a sign of intellectual work of Maria Janion, who is very symbolic persona in Polish and literary and intellectual life. And it's interesting and important because, well, it took place in Gdańsk, and Gdańsk was place of seminars of Maria Janion, and at the same time, appearance of the first gay art magazine by Ryszard Kisiel. The term queer was translated into Polish because of the volume Odmieńcy and Maria Janion, Maria Komornicka / Piotr Odmieniec-Włast, who appeared there. And another thing is Gombrowicz and the Gothic, working on the Gothic by Maria Janion, because Janion started to work on the Gothic in the early 70s, so earlier than Yves Kosowski-Sedgwick, which is very interesting. In her book, Romantism, Rewolucja, Marxism, Romantism, Revolution, Marxism, it's 1972. And there was, of course, different output than in Kosowski-Sedgwick's case. But we have to remember that Gothic can be considered as a code for expressing homosexuality and homophobia, especially homophobia. There is that famous quotation from Between Men, right? The Gothic novel crystallized for English audience the terms of dialectic between male homosexuality and homophobia, in which homophobia appeared thematically in paranoid plots. And I think that we should think from that point of view on Maria Janion's work. And then we see that when we look at Polish literary criticism in 20th century, we see very often that not named sexual monsters were excluded out of Polish national and male-centric canon. So working on Gothic and working on forgotten Gothic novel written by Witold Gombrowicz has that special function. It included sexual monsters into Polish literary canon. So once again, I think that we should treat transgressia in that way, that it was a cultural gesture of inclusion of monsters into Polish canon. And canon, as we, or some of us know, that literary canon in Polish tradition is kind of a cultural matrix of collective narratives. It's interesting that these anthologies were accused of promotion homosexuality and madness by official papers at the beginning of 80s. And another interesting thing here is that transgressia were very important for many people in the 80s and later. And because there was no introduction to any of the anthologies, people could read it differently. So it could be read as opposition to authoritarian regime and as opposition to heteronormativity. So I think that we should remember about that particular phenomena from the 80s. Beginning of the 90s, there are three novels. There are more than three, but these three are quite important, I think, because they illustrate how limited existence of a homosexual could be in Poland, and how depressing, because they show really depressing condition of homosexual. Especially significant is here Krzeszowiec's novel, because his protagonist is neither artist nor a pervert. We can say that his protagonist is a gay person. Another interesting phenomena is that in the 90s, lesbian subjects started to be articulated. And it was articulated, which is quite interesting, I think mostly by poetry, a volume of poetry. Of course, there was Eva Schilling, and it was, well, the first openly lesbian collection of short stories, but there were three volume of poetry that articulated, well, lesbian subject at the beginning of new millennium. I don't have too much time, so no, I have my 5 minutes. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about tendencies that I see now. So around 2005, there were a lot of contemporary narratives about here and now. And here we found a lot of narratives about history, which is, I think, quite symptomatic. Of course, we have narratives about now, but around 2005 we could find these novels. There are, of course, much more, but it's interesting that 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm finishing. It's interesting that it's about today's life. Of course, that was a question of legitimization of a gay in Polish society. But when we look at novels that appears now in Poland, we see that predominantly they are about these narratives are about the past. So I mentioned some of them here. Oh, okay. And there's some commonplaces, commonplace between these novels. And for example, there is a locus amanus, so the wonder years. And in many novels, the wonder years are the 90s or the 70s, like in Celerovich's novels, for example. Another interesting thing in this novel is that tension between, especially when they are writing about communist past, there's the tension between liberal law in Poland and the action of secret service and police. And another interesting thing is, and it happens a lot in these novels about history, is kind of topoi about Eastern boys and Western lovers. And I think that this distinction, East-West, has a really great impact, and this has a structural meaning for discourse about homosexuality in Poland, especially before 1989. We see it in Celerovich's novel and in Tadeusz Olszewski's novel. So we can conclude that the best way to resist homophobia in communist Poland was to find a Western lover, to put it short. And there is a different side of that story, especially when we look at the most famous novel, gay novel after 1989, Michał Witkowski-Lubiewo, Love Town, and the prequel 25, that was published 4 or 5 years ago. So when we read these two novels together, we see that distinction gay versus queer, which was very important in Love Town, is built on the distinction East versus West, a little bit. Because we can see that protagonist of the 25 can't identify as gay because he was traumatized being a male Eastern prostitute from Poland in the West, namely in Switzerland and Austria. So I will conclude and I will end with the conclusion once again that condition of being semi-peripheral or post-colonial is essential frame for conceptualizing queer history in Poland. Thank you very much. 20 minutes.